Welcome back. This is Red Hat Certified Specialist in Ansible Automation, and in this video we'll be talking about understanding the core components of Ansible. So first, a quick overview of the things that we're going to talk about in this video. The first thing we're going to look at are inventories. This is a very important concept to Ansible in general. We're also going to talk about modules, which are the tools that Ansible uses to execute commands on remote systems. We'll also discuss variables, which are useful for customizing various configurations as you work with Ansible. We'll also discuss facts, which are sort of a special type of variable that allow us to garner information from a target system. We'll also discuss plays and playbooks, both of which allow us to orchestrate various modules into overall tasks that help us achieve an end goal. Lastly, we'll talk about configuration files. These are the way we configure Ansible to behave as we desire. So first, let's talk about inventories. Inventories are how Ansible can locate and run against multiple systems. As you'll see in the screenshot included, there are two examples of how we can actually present inventories to Ansible. This screen clip is actually from the text editor Atom, which is what I prefer to use when I'm working on various YAML files. So going back to inventories, you can think of an inventory as essentially a list of hosts. By default, Ansible stores the inventory in etc Ansible hosts. You can change that. There are several ways to change that. When we get to the configuration section of this presentation, we'll talk about how to do it. So you'll notice there are actually two different inventories listed here. One is in the INI format. Windows users will probably be very familiar with that. And actually, that is the way that the default Ansible inventory is presented, is in that INI format. Being Ansible, it actually also allows you to provide inventories in a YAML format, which I find pretty useful, especially when you get into more complex inventories where you're going to be specifying certain variables for certain hosts, or when you have a lot of groupings that you would like to implement because you're, dealing with a complex system. Many servers may or may not have different roles or classes, and YAML really allows you to, in my opinion, more easily organize that information. There's nothing wrong with doing the INI format, and it's capable of doing everything you can do in YAML. I just like it for the consistency's sake because the playbooks are written in YAML, and that going back and forth business can be a little taxing. So inventory files can simply consist of a list of hosts, or as I sort of alluded to earlier, they can be a lot more robust. It's possible to define groups of hosts. You can have groups of groups. You can assign host level variables in your inventory file. And all these things you will find varying degrees of useful depending on the situations that you use Ansible in. There are a number of variables that may be used within the inventory to control how Ansible connects to and interacts with a host. As you might imagine, most of them are related to SSH. You can pass SSH arguments if you want to. You can set private key files. You can set a password, though you want to make sure that you actually use Ansible Vault, something we'll get into later, to secure that password and not just leave it in plain text. You can set usernames. There's a myriad of different variables you can configure that will allow you to customize your installation to your liking and to minimize the amount of typing you have to do, which sometimes can be convenient. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over and I'm going to walk through how to work with the inventory files a little bit, and I'll show you some examples, and we'll probably run a simple Ansible command or two just to kind of get you exposed to what we'll be doing a lot throughout the course. Alright, so let's dig into how inventories in Ansible work. So I've logged on to one of my cloud servers here. It's a RHEL 7 box. It has Ansible installed already. I'm logged in as the regular user with no escalator permissions. So to get started, let's take a look at the default inventory file used by Ansible. That file is etc Ansible hosts. And I'm using the R flag here in Vim, and that is so that if I accidentally make changes to this file, it won't let me write them. So in a sense, I'm protecting me from myself. So as you can see here, there's a lot of comments in this file, which is pretty typical of any configuration file. It goes through many examples of how you can use the inventory file and ways to specify information in it. So they go through a few different examples here. The first one, they just talk about ungrouped hosts. You can specify hosts by host name, or you can specify them by IP address. You can also, as you see here in example 2, which I'll go up and show you. You can see here in example 2, they have specified a group. That group is called web servers, and they've put a few hosts in there. They also mention how you can use patterns to specify several hosts with one line, presuming that those hosts have a pretty common name. In this case, we have 6 servers demonstrated, www1 through www6.example.com. And that kind of shorthand can be convenient, especially if you're working with a large number of hosts, as you probably will be if you're working with Ansible. So the third example here is just another group. Nothing really too complicated there. They talk a little bit about how you can or cannot use leading zeros in your pattern, which is actually pretty convenient if you have a lot of hosts that do have leading zeros. So I've actually added already my own group to the default hosts file, and it's called lab servers. And as you can see, I've added one of my cloud servers to that group. So that is the default inventory file used by Ansible. So I'm going to clear the screen here. And next we will create our own inventory file. So let's take a look at creating our own. So I'm in my home directory. I actually took the liberty of creating a directory called Ansible. So inside of that directory, I'm going to go ahead and open up a file, and I'll just call it env.ini, because I'm going to use the ini format here. So I've opened up this file, and let's add a couple of hosts to it. So we'll go ahead and add the scoldham2.mylabserver.com. And let's create a group. Let's just call this group HTTPD. So I'm going to put in that group scoldham3.mylabserver.com. And I'm going to add scoldham4 as well. And then I'm going to create one more group. I'm going to call that group lab servers, and I'm going to use the shorthand here. I'm going to specify 2 through 6 using the square brackets. And this also demonstrates that hosts can be in more than one group. So as you can see here, scoldham3 and 4 are in the HTTPD group, but I'm also including them in the lab servers group. This can be convenient, especially if servers may share roles, but not necessarily be identical. So now that we've created this simple inventory, we'll save it. And so now let's take a look at how this actually works in the command line. So let me clear the screen. And now let's run an Ansible command. So if you specify Ansible and you don't give an inventory file, it's going to assume you're wanting to use the default inventory, which, as we discussed, is etc Ansible hosts. So you need to specify either a host in the inventory or a group of hosts in the inventory so Ansible knows what to act on. So if you recall, I'd added scoldham2.mylabserver.com to the default inventory. So I'm going to specify scoldham2.mylabserver.com, and then I'm going to specify a module. We're going to talk about modules a little further on in the video. Very useful, very necessary, in fact. Modules are really the tools you use to act on servers. So I'm going to use a pretty simple, pretty handy little module called ping. And what that will do is it's going to actually ping the target server and hopefully come back with a result telling me it's up after we give it a moment. There it is. It's come back. It's successful. It gave us a pong back telling us we're up and running. So I want to demonstrate something else. There is a default group called all, which includes all hosts in a given inventory file. So when I specify all, I'm using again the default inventory. It just so happens that all is simply sclm2.mylabserver.com. So we'll do that ping again. And there we go. You see that it has returned just the same, specifying the server it found in the inventory. Had there been more than one server, you would have seen the return for each of them. In fact, we can actually demonstrate that. Let's clear the screen. And now we will use the inventory file that we just created and specify to Ansible that we would not like to use the default. We would rather use the one that we have just written. So how do we do that? We use the I flag. So I'm going to specify my env.ini file. That gives Ansible the notion to use the inventory that we have provided. So you still have to specify either a host or a group of hosts. So I'm going to reference the HTTPD group. And again, we use that ping module. And as you can see here, we've had 2 responses back as there were 2 hosts in the group. So, as you can see, you can specify an inventory of your choosing, or you can rely on the default. You've also seen the groups of hosts that you can create. You can also create groups of groups. And that concludes the demo. In the next video, we'll continue covering the core components of Ansible.